Hello everyone, and welcome to the 159th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our patron pick from November 2023, Ramsay Bolton from A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. Throughout the history of the world of Ice and Fire, there have been countless brutes and criminals that have unleashed their savagery upon the common folk and nobility alike, some in small ways, and some in sickeningly gargantuan ways. Our subject for this video, Ramsay Bolton, falls somewhere in the middle in terms of scale. Ramsay Bolton rained terror upon his people with a ferocity that few can match. And while his crimes were restricted to the northern reaches of the world, it could be argued that not a single soul in the history of Westeros came close to rivaling his sadism and barbarity, save for perhaps a certain Crow's-Eye, who will definitely receive his own episode in the future. So in this video, we're going to explore the terror that is Ramsay Bolton, and we'll do so by examining who he is in both the books and the TV series, navigating through all the information about both, as I discuss their similarities, differences, and the extensive atrocities of this sadistic monster. A small disclaimer before we continue. The crimes of Ramsay Bolton are far too gruesome to describe in detail here on YouTube, so I'll be altering my language when discussing some of the more horrendous things he's done, and I'm only doing so to avoid the mighty hammer of the censorship gods, just so you're aware. I don't mean to make light of anything he's done, quite the opposite actually, but I have to do what I have to do to stay in good standing on the platform. One thing in particular that you should be aware of is that when I use the word assault, I'm using that word as a stand-in for the R word that's used to refer to a person forcing themselves on another in an intimate way, as in my experience, YouTube isn't quite fond of that word. The rest of my censoring shouldn't need any clarification though. Now without further ado, let's begin. Let's first talk about who Ramsay is in the books, before we start talking about who he is in the show. Even before he was born, Ramsay Bolton's life was marked by brutality. Ramsay is the product of an assault made by his father upon a young miller's wife that he spied whilst hunting along the Weeping Waters portion of his holdings. Offended at these two marrying without his consent and thereby denying him his right to the first night, Roose proceeded to invoke this outlawed custom, which stipulates that it is a lord's privilege to sleep with any common woman the first night of her marriage, if he should so desire. And to further punish these two for their perceived offense, Roose had the miller hung and chose to assault his widow below her husband's hanging corpse. This barbarous and cruel act would produce a young Ramsay Snow 9 months later, and when he was born, this unnamed woman chose to take him to his father so he might acknowledge his new bastard son. When Roose received them at the Dreadfort, he nearly had both of them killed for her impudence, but he stayed his hand once he spied Ramsay's eyes, the same pale eyes that Roose possessed. And so Ramsay and his mother were allowed to live, and though his father dared not house this bastard who stood as living proof of his crimes in his own manse, he did provide for the pair by handing over ownership of the mill to his mother, sending them a yearly stipend of food, a bag of currency, and a servant to help assist Ramsay's mother in raising the boy, Reek, all of which contributed to her silence regarding Ramsay's true parentage. Now it's possible that Ramsay could have remained at the mill, but Roose Bolton's true-born son, Domeric Bolton, decided that he needed to contact his bastard brother, and after Ramsay became acquainted with him, he proceeded to murder him via poison. And with the loss of his heir, Lord Bolton was forced to acknowledge Ramsay as his son, which allowed Ramsay to gain access to all the power that House Bolton could offer him, which is when Ramsay's brutality really began to flourish. As Ramsay matured, he would prove to be as ugly on the outside as he was on the inside, and we're given the following description of his appearance by Theon during a feast. Ramsay was clad in black and pink, black boots, black belt and scabbard, and a black leather jerkin over a pink velvet doublet slashed with dark red satin. In his right ear gleamed a garnet cut in the shape of a drop of blood. Yet for all the splendor of his garb, he remained an ugly man, big-boned and slope-shouldered, with a fleshiness to him that suggested that in later life he would run to fat. His skin was pink and blotchy, his nose broad, his mouth small, his hair long and dark and dry. His lips were wide and meaty, but the thing men noticed first about him were his eyes. He had his lord father's eyes, small, close-set, queerly pale, ghost gray, some men called the shade. But in truth, his eyes were all but colorless, like 2 chips of dirty ice. Now despite the horror of his conception, there is no child born of any circumstance who is guaranteed to become a monster, and the same can be said for Ramsay. So what made Ramsay into the monster he eventually became? If you believe his father, it was Ramsay's mother and Reek who were responsible for corrupting him. I gave her Reek. It was meant to be amusing, but he and Ramsay became inseparable. I do wonder though, was it Ramsay who corrupted Reek, or Reek Ramsay? The woman disobeyed me though. You see what Ramsay is. She made him, her and Reek, always whispering in his ear about his rights. He should have been content to grind corn. Now that sounds more reasonable than simply his birth making Ramsay who he is. But there's another component to consider here as well, the traits he inherited from his father. Roose Bolton is quietly cruel, sadistic, brutal, cunning, and intelligent. Now, while the original Reek was supposedly quite nasty himself, and Ramsay very well could have learned to be all these things from him and formed a desire to be more like his father via his mother's revelation of his true parentage, I think it's reasonable to assume that Roose passed on some of who he is to Ramsay. As Theon aptly puts it in the novels, the son is just the shadow of the father, and Ramsay may have even been designed to serve as a sort of punishment for Roose's actions, as Ramsay, at least in the books, is wild, unruly, crass, and utterly without tact, a man who is similar to his father in that he's violent and merciless, but one who actually undermines his father in much of what he does due to his poor planning, impulsiveness, and general barbarity. Also, due to his status as a bastard, Ramsay has an inferiority complex and anger issues that causes him to overcompensate in order to please his father, and any mention of his bastardy will cause Ramsay to fly off the handle and torture or execute anyone who dares to label him so. Now, these similarities and differences between father and son are best found by examining their respective actions, and though he's greatly assisted in all of his criminal endeavors by his loyal band of ne'er-do-wells, the Bastards Boys, Ramsay is so personally brutal that the crimes committed on his behalf by his allies pale in comparison to what he does himself. For example, in the books, we're first introduced to Ramsay when Lady Donella Hornwood reports to Winterfell that Ramsay is amassing a sizable force at the Dreadfort. The Hornwoods and the Boltons share a border, and Lady Donella arrived at Winterfell to express her worry regarding Ramsay's intent with the forces he's mustered. Not long after this, during the harvest feast at Winterfell, Ramsay abducts Lady Hornwood and takes her back to the Dreadfort and forces her to wed him at sword point, after which he makes her sign a document claiming that he is her heir. Ramsay then proceeds to lock Lady Donella in a tower and leaves her to starve, which drove her to eat her fingers in an attempt to survive before she passed away. Ramsay then proceeds to wreak havoc on Hornwood's lands, reportedly assaulting and murdering a northern girl. And because of Ramsay's actions here, Lord Wyman Manderly sent a force from White Harbor to assist his cousin in driving the Boltons from her lands, and shortly after, an army led by Sir Rodrik Cassel from Winterfell arrived to resolve the feud between the two houses. And in the ensuing battle, Ramsay's own force was eliminated, and his servant Reek killed after Ramsay switched clothes with him so he could escape the judgment of the Manderlys. Now let's examine one of his father's most famous crimes, his participation in the infamous Red Wedding. Roose Bolton conspired with the Freys and the Lannisters to murder King Robb, most of his soldiers, commanders, and lords all at once by spilling blood at the wedding of Lord Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey, taking his former allies by surprise by breaking the sacred law of hospitality and eliminating nearly all of his most dangerous enemies in one fell swoop, so he might ride to the north unopposed and consolidate his power with his new title of Warden of the North that was granted to him by Lord Tywin Lannister. Now, in comparing these two different plots, there's one stark difference between them: the scope of the planning that went into them. When Roose has an idea, he makes his best effort to plan every aspect of his ensuing plot so it can be executed as flawlessly as possible without damaging his reputation or interests too heavily. He still employs intense amounts of cruelty and brutality in order to better facilitate his plans, but he does so in a way that ensures any backlash he or his house might receive from his machinations is as minimal as they can possibly be. On the other hand, when Ramsay has an idea, it would appear that he thinks of his own desires first and then formulates the most sadistically satisfying plan he can think of that will make his goals a reality without putting too much thought into what the ramifications of his actions might be. In the aforementioned example I gave you, Ramsay wanted to acquire the Hornwood lands, and he did pick an apt time to do so when you consider that both Lord Hornwood and his heir were now deceased, and the only real legal way for Ramsay to acquire these lands was to marry the widowed Lady Hornwood. However, instead of figuring out a way to court Lady Hornwood, or at the very least ensnare her in a way that would force her to marry him in a less gruesome fashion, and perhaps even playing as her husband for a time before killing her in some covert way, he kidnaps her, locks her in a tower, and starves her to death. Then he proceeds to rampage through her lands like a tyrant king who knows no limits. Because of his impulsiveness here, Ramsay nearly loses his life, and he severely damages his reputation and the reputation of his house in the process, and this only further erodes any confidence in or respect for House Bolton that the Northerners may have had in the coming years. And had Ramsay the wherewithal to follow in his father's footsteps and attempt to play out his dark fantasies in a more organized and covert manner, he'd be monstrously more successful in his sordid endeavors. This is one of the hallmarks of Ramsay Bolton. When he desires something, he takes it. And he takes it in the most horrific way he can imagine, so he might exact as much sadistic pleasure from his victims as possible, no matter what it might cost him in the long run. Another pertinent example of this type of behavior is his treatment of his second wife, Arya Stark, who in reality is Jane Poole, Sansa's former best friend and daughter of the Steward of Winterfell. Ramsay chooses to beat and assault Jane on a nightly basis, much like Ramsay in the show does with Sansa, even possibly forcing Jane to lay with one of his hounds, treatment that causes Jane to constantly cry and wail loudly all day and night. point. Perhaps this might not have been an issue for Ramsay had he treated Jane like this in a subtle or secretive way, where nobody could hear. But he treats his new wife like this whilst his father is hosting many of their most important allied lords at Winterfell. And as Lady Dustin tells it, this is causing immense damage to House Bolton's precarious position. "The bride weeps," Lady Dustin said. "Our little Lady Arya. Dressing her in grey and white serves no good if the girl is left to sob. The Freys may not care, but the Northmen, they fear the Dreadfort, but they love the Starks. Old Horsebane is only here because the Freys hold the Greatjon captive. And do you imagine the Hornwood men have forgotten the bastard's last marriage, and how his lady wife was left to starve, chewing her own fingers? What do you think passes through their heads when they hear the new bride weeping? Valiant Ned's precious little girl. Lady Arya's sobs do us more harm than all of Lord Stannis' swords and spears. If the bastard means to remain Lord of Winterfell, he had best teach his wife to laugh." As you can see, much of the same issues that arose because of Ramsay's treatment of Lady Hornwood also occur through his treatment of Jane. Not to mention that Ramsay's treatment of Jane, and Sansa in the show, eventually caused Theon to find some courage and help them escape. And while Ramsay isn't stupid by any means, his sadism is always at the forefront of his mind, and it severely clouds his judgment. Now clearly both Ramsay and his father Roose suffer from psychopathy, a heightened and more dangerous form of antisocial personality disorder, though it could be argued that Roose is some sort of otherworldly monster, which no disorder can properly describe. While they are both psychopaths, Ramsay has many tendencies and inclinations that border on the sociopathic, and to describe the differences and similarities between the two, and how they apply to both Ramsay and Roose, I'd like to read for you now the symptoms of ASPD, and I'm also going to be providing you with an analogy I crafted in a recent video, so we can better understand Ramsay's mind and actions. Feel free to skip this section if you've seen that video using the timestamp down below, but for those of you who haven't, let's take a look at the symptoms associated with ASPD that you can find on the Mayo Clinic's website. Symptoms of antisocial personality disorder include repeatedly ignoring right and wrong, telling lies to take advantage of others, not being sensitive to or respectful of others, using charm or wit to manipulate others for personal gain or pleasure, having a sense of superiority and being extremely opinionated, having problems with the law, including criminal behavior, being hostile, aggressive, violent, or threatening to others, feeling no guilt about harming others, doing dangerous things with no regard for the safety of self or others, being irresponsible and failing to fulfill work or financial responsibilities. Additionally, adults with antisocial personality disorder usually show symptoms of conduct disorder before the age of 15. Symptoms of conduct disorder include serious, ongoing behavior problems, such as aggression towards people and animals, destruction of property, lying and dishonesty, theft, and serious violation of rules. Now, you don't need to have all of these symptoms to be diagnosed with ASPD, but most of these things apply to both Roose and Ramsay. But to understand why Roose is more so solidly a psychopath, while Ramsay is a psychopath with sociopathic tendencies, we need only to keep in mind the comparisons I made between the way they handle their respective plans. The main difference between a sociopath and a psychopath isn't necessarily that a psychopath is more intelligent than a sociopath, but that a psychopath is able to quell their emotions and impulses to a certain degree, whereas a sociopath has much more difficulty doing so. And this allows the psychopath to think clearer, so they can better maintain relationships, project a sense of averageness or normalcy to other people, and more thoroughly plan out any of the various criminal endeavors they aim to undertake. I believe an apt analogy for these differences would be to compare a sociopath and a psychopath to a starving predator and a well-fed predator respectively. While a starving predator is liable to act recklessly and indiscriminately when hunting for food due to the intense hunger clouding its mind, a predator that is regularly able to obtain food won't have that handicap affecting their decisions and will therefore hunt for its prey in a more methodical way. For the sociopath, that hunger manifests in the form of instability, minds that are plagued by impulses that for one reason or another they're unable to control on a regular basis. Psychopaths, on the other hand, are able to maintain a certain degree of mental stability, and they are thus less likely to take risks or behave erratically when engaging in nefarious activities. Now, if we continue to evaluate the starving versus well-fed predator example, you'll find that we can discern the different levels of danger that a sociopath presents when compared to a psychopath through this analogy as well. Because a starving predator is more likely to strike at its target based off its incessant hunger, despite the circumstances or downsides to doing so, when faced with a starving predator, their prey has to contend with the ferocity of their typically unexpected, yet spur-of-the-moment assaults. An assault that their prey may not be aware of initially, but one that has a certain amount of predictability associated with it. As if a hunger-crazed predator is charging at you without much thought put into their approach, you can at least see them coming and try to avoid them as best you can. person. When being hunted by a well-fed predator, their prey might not even be aware that they're being hunted, as this predator will be more methodical and careful in its approach to capturing and killing its prey, and an unseen threat is always far more difficult to combat when compared to a threat that presents itself to you blatantly. Now, sociopaths aren't always reckless, and neither is a starving predator, as both are more than capable of putting some thought into any murderous actions they aim to take. However, their instability or hunger significantly dampens their ability to do so, and it makes it so they're more likely to behave irrationally rather than rationally. Similarly, a psychopath and a well-fed predator are also capable of acting irrationally when pursuing their intended targets. However, their comparably higher levels of stability, or lessened hunger pains, allows them to think clearer and more effectively so they can carefully pursue their prey, which is both less risky for the psychopath or predator and also results in a higher rate of success when compared to the sociopaths and starving predators in all aspects of their illicit or murderous endeavors. At the end of the day, they're both still predators. However, one is clearly less stable and unpredictable, whereas the other is much more composed and highly methodical, and the difference between Roose and Ramsay in this regard is reflected in their personalities and actions. Roose is nearly emotionless, brutal, cruel, sadistic, and wholly without mercy or empathy, but he's able to rein in his darker tendencies and put his overall goals first while keeping his own desires in check, which allows us to designate him as a true psychopath. And this is perhaps the most dangerous type of person that can exist in any universe, especially when they're in a position of power. Ramsay, on the other hand, while just as bloodthirsty and sadistic, is far less organized, meticulous, and level-headed. He has issues with his anger and poor impulse control, and as far as long-term planning and overall mental clarity is concerned, Ramsay is at a significant disadvantage, though Ramsay is far from being unintelligent, and he's still able to plan out his actions to a certain degree, especially in the TV series, which is why I believe he's best characterized as a psychopath with sociopathic tendencies. Ramsay is still very, very dangerous, but Roose is a man that could potentially maneuver his way around every disadvantage that his barbarity might present, live for decades, and die peacefully in his sleep, whereas Ramsay is more likely to live a short, yet brazenly grotesque and brutal life, getting himself killed after one of his cruel fantasies places him in the crosshairs of either his victims' loved ones, or his allies, as a man like Ramsay has few true allies. Ramsay assumes that the fear he instills in people will be enough to drive off any threat, but fear is never everything, and if a person wants to earn respect, prestige, and live a long life, ruling by fear is a surefire way to get the first two for a time, but that time is always short. Now, in the Game of Thrones TV series, Ramsay is a similar, yet much different beast than he is in the books. Born under similar conditions, though without his mother and a servant named Reek to raise him, Ramsay seems to have grown up in the Dreadfort under his father's care, learning his traditions and enjoying the comfort of highborn adjacent living. Ramsay's personality in this version of the story is nearly identical to that of his literary counterpart. The main difference between the two lies in their appearance. A good comparison to make between the two, if one were to use monster-related epithets to describe these beasts, would be to label Book Ramsay as a well-dressed ogre who manages to appear lordly in short bursts before his uncontrollable sadism eventually gets the better of him, and Show Ramsay is best described as a charming little imp who's hiding its overt bloodthirst through guile and a well-crafted facade. Whereas Book Ramsay is described as an overgrown and ugly brute, Ramsay in the show is actually fairly handsome and of average to below average size. While the barbarity of the book version certainly provides plenty of terror to anyone reading of his misdeeds, these differences accentuate the horror of the show version. Because Ramsay is handsome and of an average build, he's able to more effectively hide his cruelty when compared to his counterpart. He's still overly brutal and impulsive, but people are more willing to trust his gentle face and mild demeanor than they are the hideous and grotesque features and mannerisms of Book Ramsay. A good example of this is how he tricks Theon upon first meeting him in the show into believing that he's an Ironborn who's come to rescue him. Ramsay has Theon thoroughly convinced that he's his ally, even more so when Ramsay murders the hunting party sent after Theon to keep up the charade. Ramsay manages to convince Theon of his trustworthiness to the point that he even reveals to him the secret of Bran and Rickon's survival, something that I'm sure Ramsay wasn't planning on learning, but is the type of information he was looking to gain from Theon by feigning friendship with him. Now, Book Ramsay tricks Theon as well, but his trickery was born out of a desire for survival, as following his escape from the Manderly forces that we discussed earlier, Ramsay posing as Reek was taken back to Winterfell to be held prisoner, and once Theon conquered the castle, he released Ramsay and allowed him to serve him. And though he managed to become one of Theon's most trusted advisors during his time at Winterfell, his trust was earned by playing the lowly and harmless servant that Theon could trust to feed him information. And even then, Ramsay posing as Reek still couldn't help but let his brutality leak through, as he offered Theon suggestions combinations of flaying and murder to settle the score with his enemies, a difference in strategy and circumstance that highlights the advantage Ramsay has in gaining the confidence of others in a more straightforward way without having to debase himself. However, like the book version, the horror of Ramsay Bolton is best evaluated through his actions, and apart from the ones book Ramsay takes that we've already discussed, and a few that he takes towards the end of his story, most of them are similar to the ones that were given in the book. Take their frequent willingness to use murder as a punishment for any perceived slight, and their unwillingness to provide any mercy to their enemies despite any promises they've made to them. Both Ramsays frequently murder and flay people for reasons ranging from the smallest inconveniences to the largest crimes, like when he flays the woman who was aiding Sansa in her escape. And as far as reneging on any promises he makes to others, we have his massacre of the Ironborn who were stationed at Moat Cailin, men who he promised would be granted safe passage to the sea if they yielded the castle, but men who he promptly had murdered and flayed once they fulfilled his conditions. These type of actions go a long way in further highlighting his wanton brutality and untrustworthiness, but it's his treatment of Theon that serves as one of the most harrowing examples of his cruelty. In the show, we're given a much more visual representation of Ramsay's breaking of Theon. He first deceives him, then flays him, then has him emasculated, after which he beats and whips him into submission until he's transformed into the creature known as Reek, forcing Theon to sleep with his dogs and live as walking excrement. As much as I'd like to read to you directly what Ramsay does to Theon in the book, it's much too descriptive for YouTube. But even though we aren't given actual scenes of Ramsay's tortures in the book, we do know that he severed several of Theon's fingers and toes after he had them flayed, broke or knocked out several of his teeth, whipped and beat him, and possibly emasculated, and perhaps even assaulted him as well. Theon was also made to sleep in the dungeons with the other prisoners without any light for days on end, where he was forced to subsist on rats, before Ramsay allowed him the privilege of sleeping in the kennels with his dogs, transforming Theon into the loyal servant that he lost. In the show, throughout these torture scenes, we're treated to Ramsay's gleeful and casually cruel sadism. Twisted smiles plastered across his face as Theon screams in agony, as his skin is peeled from his bones and his mind is crushed beyond recognition. And afterwards, we see him abusing Theon like a beaten dog once he's lost any shred of who he once was. And much the same occurs in the novel, as Ramsay consistently berates and abuses Theon at any chance he's given. One thing that doesn't appear in the show that adds another layer of disgust to Ramsay's character is how he handles his first night with his bride Arya Stark. In the show, Ramsay makes Theon watch as he brutally takes Sansa's virginity, which is horrendous to witness on its own. But in the book, he does exactly the same thing, only prior to engaging in intimacy, he has Theon prep Jane with his mouth, which manages to elevate the cruelty of this scene to a greater degree than it was already at. Now, another brutal practice of Ramsay's that's more expansive in the books is his propensity to hunt humans, specifically women that he fancies. In the show, we find Ramsay hunting Tansy with Miranda because she made Miranda jealous, a sadistic act that he and his macabre lover thoroughly enjoy. But in the novels, Ramsay purportedly engages in these types of hunts quite frequently, loosing women into the wilds and hunting them with his fearless hounds, assaulting them once he captures them, and then either murdering them himself or having his dogs rip them to pieces. And if these women put up a good enough fight, he graciously grants their name to one of his dogs. And if this behavior doesn't send even more of a shiver down your spine than the actions I've already described to you, I'm not sure what will. Now, with everything we've discussed so far regarding his treatment of Theon and others, there's something intimately important to both versions of Ramsay's character that we can now examine that serves as the driving force behind how he treats people, and that's how he views people. Just like anyone suffering from ASPD, it's hard for Ramsay to empathize with others, though we do see him expressing a certain degree of emotion when Miranda dies in the show, even if he has her fed to his dogs afterwards. But it's not just that Ramsay can't place himself in someone else's shoes and empathize with the pain he's inflicting upon them. It's the fact that Ramsay Bolton views people as animals. And more specifically, he's a person who views them as dogs in the same way that someone who trains dogs to fight views dogs. They aren't living, breathing beings with thoughts and feelings. They're playthings, tools to be used and abused for the sake of violence and amusement. Ramsay is an expert at training dogs into vicious murder machines. And because he sees people the same way he sees dogs, he's able to train them in a similar way. Though not to be murder machines, but browbeaten lapdogs that are ready to feast on his waist at a moment's notice. And while his treatment of Jane in her subsequent break that I described to you earlier shows this well enough, it's really his treatment of Theon that highlights Ramsay's dread skill in this area. Ramsay so severely beats Theon into submission that as Reek, he's essentially become a dog, and after Ramsay has instilled a serious case of Stockholm Syndrome within Theon, he's able to more effectively manipulate him by occasionally allowing him to enjoy basic luxuries that serve to keep Theon devoted to his ever-so-loving master, a man so destroyed that he wouldn't even dare to nick his master while shaving him. Despite his skills in barbarity and manipulation, Ramsay still has far too many sadistic tendencies that mark him as a man who was eventually destined to fail. In both the books and the show, Ramsay and his father play a dangerous game with one another. Ramsay by brazenly pushing the limits of his barbarity, and Roose by hanging the possible birth of a true-born son via his new wife Walda over Ramsay's head. Though Ramsay is quite useful to his father in many ways, barring the likelihood that Ramsay would eventually be dispatched by one of his enemies, the story of Ramsay and Roose Bolton was always going to end in one of two ways. Either Ramsay would be murdered by his father, or Ramsay would murder his father. In the novels, we're not quite sure yet how their story will end, because as of the end of A Dance with Dragons, Ramsay has reportedly laid waste to Stannis Baratheon's army in a similar way that he does in the show, and we're given no mention of whether or not his father is still living following this event. However, in the show, we are given the conclusion of Ramsay's story, and the beginning of the end for Ramsay Bolton was the murder of his father. After receiving news of his baby brother's birth, Ramsay murders his father by stabbing him in the gut, and he then has his newborn baby brother and his stepmother Walda fed to his dogs. Ramsay then proceeds to consolidate his power as Warden of the North by solidifying his ties to House Karstark and House Umber, two allies that will prove invaluable to him in the coming battle against Jon Snow and his wildling army. After executing Rickon Stark in cold blood by forcing him to play a sick game, a battle of epic proportions ensues that nearly sees Ramsay as the victor and perhaps future uncontested Warden of the North, or even King in the North. But with the timely help of the Knights of the Vale, Ramsay's forces are smashed, and he endures his final defeat. Now, had Ramsay not harmed nearly everyone he had come in contact with, and made better decisions, it's possible that he may have won out over Jon Snow, especially if he had kept his father alive. But after the battle has concluded, and we find Ramsay confronted by Sansa and the kennels he loved to imprison people in, we're given a few things to ponder regarding Ramsay and his crimes. Ramsay says to Sansa, "You can't kill me. I'm a part of you now," which unfortunately is true to an extent. For every person that's ever suffered trauma or abuse, they will never be completely free of the memories of the horror they experienced. With time comes healing, and old wounds become less painful, but the pain still remains. And in that way, Ramsay will live on within his victims, so long as there are people alive to remember the pain he inflicted upon them. Though Sansa is correct in stating that Ramsay won't be able to hurt anyone any longer, and that he will be forgotten in time. A legacy of brutality that will only serve as a footnote in the otherwise long history of Westeros. When Sansa declares that his dogs are going to serve as his executioners, Ramsay remarks that they're loyal beasts that won't harm him. But Sansa then remarks that yes, they are loyal beasts, but now they're starving. Prior to the battle, Ramsay had starved his dogs in anticipation of feeding his enemies to these hungry hounds, a plan which in this moment has clearly backfired on him. Just like with his starving dogs, he had the potential to amass a slew of loyal servants, friends, family members, associates, and soldiers, but each and every one of those people were eventually starved by Ramsay either literally or in a metaphorical way. Every person that Ramsay encountered was poisoned by his person and ruined by his barbarity and his relentless sadism. And whether it was his own dogs that he had put so much faith in, or any other number of people he'd harmed over the course of his life, Ramsay was always meant to be devoured by those he had wronged. And devoured he was, rightfully so, as the crimes of Ramsay Bolton were gruesome, abhorrent, and utterly horrendous. A man who was certainly negatively impacted by the circumstances of his birth and parentage, and in that way, he might deserve some leniency when judging his character and actions when you consider he, like any man-turned-monster, never asked to be who he is. But when you keep in mind everything we've discussed, all the overtly cruel and insanely depraved actions that this monster took over the course of his life, and the thousands of lives that he either ruined or destroyed, whatever sympathy there is to be had for Ramsay Bolton and his story is surely cancelled out due to the magnitude of his crimes and his unrelenting dedication to evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Ramsay Bolton? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.